The day started like many others. I was cleaning the kitchen, filling the silence with the soft clinking of dishes and the hum of the refrigerator. When something fell behind the stove, a lid from a spice jar, I bent down to retrieve it. My hand got stuck in the narrow gap between the stove and the counter. Panic set in, and my attempts to free myself only made things worse. "Are you okay?" I heard a voice. Turning sharply, I saw Kyle standing in the doorway. He looked a bit confused, but stepped closer. "My hand, it stuck," I said, feeling my face flush. Kyle nodded silently and moved closer. His fingers gently grasped my arm, and despite my embarrassment, he acted confidently. A few moments later, I was free. "Thanks," I muttered awkwardly, avoiding his gaze. But he was already looking at me, his eyes lingering longer than they should have. My semi-transparent robe revealed more than I would have liked. I felt my cheeks flush, and I tightened the belt around my waist. "Are you okay?" he finally asked. There was something strange in his voice, something I couldn't quite place. "Yes, I'm fine." "Thank you, Kyle," I replied, avoiding his eyes. He nodded, and without another word, turned and left the kitchen. His presence had filled the room, and now that he was gone, it felt strangely empty. I stood there, staring at my freed hand, unable to shake the odd feeling. His gaze, his touch, it all left a mark. Later that evening, David came home, as always, absorbed in his work. His exhaustion was almost palpable, and our conversations had dwindled to routine questions about how the day went. I mentioned what had happened with Kyle, but David barely paid attention, nodding absently. I knew he loved me, but there were times I felt invisible. That night, lying in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. Kyle's gaze, his touch. It was all wrong, yet something about that look stirred something inside me. I tried to dismiss the thought, to forget, but the feeling wouldn't let go. To improve the atmosphere at home, David suggested spending the weekend in the mountains. He thought a change of scenery would help us all relax. I agreed with him. There had been an odd tension between David, Kyle, and me lately, and a short trip might be just what we needed. We packed our things, loaded them into the car, and set off. The drive was long, with Kyle and me in the back seat while David focused on the road. At first, the conversation didn't flow, and we each seemed lost in our own thoughts. But after a while, Kyle started talking about his plans for school and his career. His voice grew more animated as he spoke, but I noticed he avoided looking directly at me. I wasn't sure how to act either. The events of the other day still weighed on my mind, and I was afraid to see something in his eyes that I couldn't ignore. When we arrived at the chalet, we were greeted with a breathtaking view of the snow-capped peaks. The cabin was small but cozy, with panoramic windows that let us take in the beauty of nature. We all breathed a sigh of relief, as if leaving the tension behind at home, and began unpacking. In the evening, David suggested we take a walk to get some fresh air. We left the cabin and gradually split up. David went ahead while Kyle and I lagged behind. The snowy path led us through the woods, and suddenly we found ourselves alone. Silence surrounded us, broken only by the soft crunch of snow underfoot. "Do you think things have been strange between us lately?" Kyle asked suddenly, his voice uncertain. I felt a pang inside. "Maybe," I replied cautiously, looking down at the snow. "Everything's just changed. You've grown up. I'm still getting used to it." Kyle was quiet for a moment, then stopped and looked at me. There was something in his eyes that made me stop too. "I don't know how to get used to it either," he said quietly. "Everything feels different. Do you feel it too?" His words touched something raw in me. I avoided looking at him, afraid my feelings might betray me. This conversation shouldn't have gone this far. "I think we just need time to adjust," I said, trying to stay calm. "Things will settle." Kyle looked at me intently but said nothing more. We continued walking, catching up with David, and there was a quiet but meaningful pause between us. The next day, David suggested a hike to the nearby waterfall. The morning was sunny, the air crisp, and it seemed like a perfect way to spend time together. We packed a small backpack with water and snacks and set off along a narrow path leading deeper into the forest. The trail turned out to be more challenging than I expected. It went steeply uphill and then dropped sharply down. Kyle walked behind me, occasionally offering his hand to help me over particularly difficult sections. I felt his attention and care. Each time he touched my hand to support me, I could feel his strength and warmth. These touches, innocent at first glance, left a mark, making me think. Finally, we reached the waterfall. The water cascaded down with a roar, and the spray filled the air with coolness. David stopped a bit ahead, enjoying the view, while Kyle and I stayed behind. I sat down on a large flat rock to rest, and Kyle remained nearby. He looked at me as if he saw something he could no longer hide. His gaze was deep, searching, and I felt a tension building inside me. In that moment, silence hung between us, full of something indescribable, as if the air itself had thickened. I knew this moment was on the edge of turning into something more. Kyle took a step toward me, his eyes locked on mine. I knew what he wanted to do, and I understood that if I didn't stop him now, everything would change. My hand trembled involuntarily, and I raised it slightly as if to ask him to stop. "Kyle, don't," I whispered, my voice barely audible but firm. He froze, his face a mixture of disappointment and embarrassment. In that moment, I felt particularly vulnerable, faced with a choice that could destroy everything David and I had built. I couldn't let that happen. We were a family, and I didn't want to lose it for something so uncertain and possibly fleeting. Kyle turned away, his eyes downcast. He stepped back, giving me space, but something in his expression revealed pain and regret. I felt a struggle within me, desire battling fear. We stood in silence, the only sound the rush of the waterfall, until David came over, talking animatedly about the beauty of the scenery, oblivious to the tension between us. I smiled, responding to my husband, but my thoughts were far away. Something between Kyle and me had changed, and I didn't know how to handle it. I tried to convince myself that things would stay the same, but something inside me already doubted it. After the trip to the mountains, I tried to keep my distance and remain composed. The time spent in nature felt like a dreamy mirage, and returning home shattered that illusion into pieces. I decided it would be best to avoid being alone with Kyle. Those silent glances, the tension in the air. I needed to leave it all behind. David seemed completely unaware of what was happening. He buried himself in work, as if our everyday life simply didn't exist. He spent his time with a laptop on his lap or on calls with his colleagues, often forgetting to ask how my day had gone. He believed that everything between us was fine. We weren't arguing, we weren't having conflicts, and to David, that was enough to assume everything was as it should be. But this fine was slowly but surely eating me up inside. On the surface, our marriage seemed stable, but deep down I felt an overwhelming sense of emptiness and loneliness. I longed for warmth, for recognition, and I couldn't ignore the fact that this kind of attention had long been missing. David didn't even notice how I tried to keep my distance from Kyle, how difficult our interactions had become for me. Kyle, for his part, started paying more attention to me, and though his actions were restrained, I felt that it wasn't just simple care. He closely watched how I reacted to his words, how I avoided his gaze. He would get up to help me when I needed something, or offer to make tea when I looked tired. His attention was constant, even if we didn't speak directly to each other. I realized that my feelings for Kyle were growing stronger. Every time he passed by and accidentally touched my hand or shoulder, something stirred inside me. I tried to suppress those feelings, to convince myself it was just a passing thrill. But the more I tried to ignore it, the harder it became to handle. One night, I lay in bed listening to David's soft breathing as he slept beside me. I turned toward him, trying to feel the warmth that used to be between us. But instead, all I felt was distance. The inner conflict grew. I knew what I was feeling was wrong. I loved David, or at least I loved the idea of us that I held in my mind. But then there was Kyle, and something about his presence pulled me in, despite all the danger that path held. That day, the kitchen faucet broke. Water was running uncontrollably, splashing everywhere. David was at work and I was in a panic, trying to figure out how to shut it off. Kyle heard the noise and quickly came into the kitchen. "Let me help," he said, giving me a slight smile. He confidently approached the sink and turned off the water supply. "Thanks," I exhaled, feeling awkward. "I think we'll need to replace the faucet." "I can fix it," Kyle replied, and before I could say anything, he was already looking for tools. There was a toolbox in the house, and he knew where to find it. I watched as he carefully worked on the faucet, and I couldn't help but notice how much he had grown and become independent. He was no longer the boy I once knew. When he asked me to hold a nut in place, I stepped closer. We were so close that I could smell him, a warm, slightly sweet scent that made something inside me flip. Our hands accidentally touched, and that touch seemed to create an invisible spark. I looked at Kyle, and he looked at me. There was something in his eyes that made my heart skip a beat. Everything around us seemed to freeze. I knew I should step away, that this was wrong, but my feet wouldn't move. "Jessica," he said quietly, and there was so much emotion in his voice that I froze. The next second, he leaned in and kissed me. It was sudden and bold. I tried to push him away, my hands pressing against his chest, but instead I felt my fingers tremble and my resistance weaken. My mind screamed at me to stop this, but my body wouldn't listen. The kiss was soft yet insistent, and I felt the world around us fade away. I gave in, kissing him back, feeling the barriers between us collapse. But then I realized what I was doing. Guilt flooded over me like an icy wave. I abruptly pushed Kyle away and stepped back, feeling tears well up in my eyes. "No, Kyle," I whispered, struggling to breathe. "This is wrong. We shouldn't." Without waiting for his response, I turned and ran out of the kitchen. Tears streamed down my face, and I couldn't stop them. The guilt I felt toward David was unbearable. I loved him, and what had just happened was a betrayal I couldn't forgive myself for. I locked myself in the bedroom trying to calm down, but thoughts of Kyle wouldn't leave me. I didn't understand how we had reached this point, and I didn't know what to do next. Everything inside me felt shattered. After I ran out of the kitchen in tears, I made a decision. Nothing like that could ever happen again. It was a boundary that should never be crossed again. The next morning, I avoided meeting Kyle's eyes and tried not to cross paths with him in the house. When it did happen, I remained cold and distant. I knew he wanted to talk, to discuss what had happened, but I couldn't let that happen. "We need to talk," he said one day when we met in the hallway. I was about to leave the house to buy groceries. "No, Kyle." My voice was tense, and I avoided his gaze. "There's nothing to discuss. Please, just leave it." He stepped closer, and I felt my heart start pounding faster. But I turned away and walked past him, heading outside. I needed to get away from there as quickly as possible, not to hear his words, not to feel his presence. Each day the tension between us grew, and it was becoming more and more obvious. Every time he entered the room, I felt my body tense, trying to hide my emotions, to not show the storm that was raging inside me. David started to notice the changes, though he didn't make much of them. One evening, as we were having dinner alone, he looked up from his plate and asked, "Is everything okay, Jess? You seem a bit on edge lately." I tried to smile, though I felt emptiness inside. "Yeah, just a lot going on," I said, looking away. "Everything's fine." David nodded, satisfied with my answer, and continued eating, lost in his thoughts again. He was, as always, immersed in his work, and his lack of attention to my inner struggles only deepened my loneliness. I wanted to share with him, to tell him how hard things were for me right now, but I knew I couldn't do that. I couldn't tell him about Kyle, about the feelings that had begun to overwhelm me. Every time I saw Kyle, I wanted to stop, to talk, to explain, but fear, shame, and guilt were too strong. We avoided each other, but in that silence there were more words than I could ever express. It felt like the world we lived in was getting smaller, and the space around us was filled with unbearable tension. I started to wonder if I could even keep our family together after everything that had happened. From time to time, I caught myself thinking that things could have been different. Maybe if I let myself talk to Kyle, to explain, it would have been easier for both of us. But I was afraid that such a conversation would reveal something I didn't want to see, that these feelings, these passions hadn't gone away, but had only quieted, waiting for the right moment. At night, I couldn't sleep, replaying the events of the past days in my mind. I loved David, but what had happened between Kyle and me changed everything. I felt my inner balance crumbling, and I didn't know how to handle it. All I could do was try to maintain the semblance of a normal life, even though inside everything was chaos. The house was filled with noise and laughter. David decided to host a family evening with friends, hoping it would ease the tension. He invited a few close friends, and the house was soon full of lively conversations and the smells of food. I tried not to think about how difficult it would be to spend the entire evening pretending that everything was fine. Kyle, like me, tried to appear calm, but there was tension in his eyes. We both tried to avoid each other, but being in the same house made that nearly impossible. Every time I caught his gaze, I saw something in it that made my heart skip a beat. We smiled at the guests, made small talk, but between us there was something more, something no one else knew about. As the evening progressed, David and his friends decided to move into the living room to watch some sports broadcast. I stayed in the kitchen, clearing the dirty plates, when I felt someone approach from behind. I turned around to see Kyle. "Can I help?" he asked, and I heard more than just a willingness to help in his voice. "It's fine, Kyle," I replied, trying to keep my composure, but he didn't leave. I picked up a couple of plates and walked out to the garden, trying to distract myself and get away from his presence. The night air was cool and I took a deep breath, trying to calm down. But Kyle followed me. "Jessica, we can't just ignore what happened," he said quietly, and there was a hint of desperation in his voice. I closed my eyes, trying not to look at him. "We have to, Kyle," I said. "We don't have a choice. It was a mistake." He took a step toward me and I felt my heart start pounding faster. Everything inside me screamed that I should leave, but my legs wouldn't move. His closeness felt too real, too alluring. "Do you really think that?" he asked, his voice quiet but filled with pain. "Do you really want everything to go back to the way it was?" I didn't answer. My feelings were too complicated, and any word I said would only make things worse. I took a step back, turning away from him, and heard him sigh heavily. "Please, Kyle," I whispered, not turning around. "We should get back to the guests." We returned to the house as if nothing had happened. I smiled at David's friends, made small talk, but inside there was emptiness. After the guests left and the house fell silent once again, I realized that my feelings for Kyle were impossible to ignore. I tried to convince myself it was just a temporary infatuation, that I could go back to my normal life, but those thoughts no longer seemed convincing. When David said he was leaving for a client meeting and would be back late, I felt a strange sense of unease. Kyle and I would be alone in the house, and I knew that avoiding the tension between us would be impossible. All day, I tried to keep my distance, busying myself with small chores, but I knew that sooner or later we'd have to talk. It was evening when Kyle finally decided. He approached me in the kitchen, where I was preparing dinner, and said, "We need to talk, Jessica. We can't keep going on like this." I took a deep breath, knowing there was no point in delaying this conversation any longer. I nodded, and we moved to the living room where the atmosphere was slightly less tense than in the kitchen. He sat across from me and I crossed my arms over my chest, trying to prepare myself for what was to come. "Why are you avoiding me?" he started, and there was pain in his voice. "You can't just ignore what happened." "It was a mistake, Kyle," I replied, trying to sound confident. "We shouldn't have done it. I'm married, and we need to forget about it." He shook his head, his gaze growing more serious. "Do you really think you can just forget about it?" His voice was quiet but firm. "I can't. And honestly, I don't think you can either. We shouldn't talk about this," I said, trying to hold on to my composure. "It'll only make things worse." But Kyle didn't back down. His face showed both desperation and determination. He stood up and came closer. My back tensed and I instinctively stepped back, but the walls of the living room didn't allow me to go far. In his eyes, I saw the same emotions that were tearing me apart. "Jessica, please tell me the truth," he said. "Do you really want everything to go back to the way it was?" His words struck something deep inside me, and I felt the growing storm of emotions breaking free. I couldn't hold back anymore, and standing up, I blurted out, "Yes, I want everything to be like it was, but it's impossible, Kyle. Do you think it's easy for me?" His eyes sparkled with emotion, and in the next moment he was suddenly right there. His hands gently cupped my face, and I felt the warmth of his fingers. Time seemed to stop, and he kissed me. this kiss was entirely different, full of desperation and passion that we had both resisted for so long. I felt my own barriers crumble. I kissed him back, feeling the entire world around us fade away. It was wrong, but at that moment, I didn't care. I wanted him just as much as he wanted me. But then there was the sound of footsteps outside. We both pulled away from each other abruptly, and I turned my head towards the window. In the darkness, I saw a shadow and my heart sank. It was our neighbor walking by, and I wasn't sure if he had seen anything. Kyle and I exchanged a silent glance, trying to gauge how much danger we were in. Everything that had just happened seemed impossible and unreal, but the fact remained. Someone could have seen us. I felt panic rising in my throat, but I tried not to show it. "We should stop," I whispered, barely breathing. Kyle didn't reply. He just nodded, and I felt the tension between us become unbearable once again. The morning after that kiss began with a sense of anxiety and dread. I couldn't forget what had happened. The image of Kyle, his kiss, his eyes, it all seemed stuck in my mind, poisoning every thought. But what terrified me most was the idea that someone might have seen us, and maybe that fear wasn't unfounded. When I heard the front door slam, I was in the kitchen. David had returned earlier than expected, and there was something in his expression that made my blood run cold. In his hand was his phone, and without saying a word, he walked over and threw a few blurry photos onto the table in front of me. I flinched at the sight. It was Kyle and me, caught in the moment of our kiss. "Can you explain this?" His voice was quiet, but it was filled with all the pent-up fury he was holding back. He looked at me, his eyes burning with betrayal and pain. I tried to say something, but the words caught in my throat. Everything around me seemed to blur, and I felt my knees start to give way. David threw his phone onto the table, his fingers clenched into fists, and he turned away from me as if he couldn't even bear to look at me. "Did you betray me, Jessica?" he asked, his voice breaking into a shout. "I trusted you. I thought we were a family." At that moment, Kyle walked into the living room, drawn by the noise. He saw the photos and David barely holding back his anger. In Kyle's eyes, I saw confusion and fear. He understood that everything had spiraled out of control. "It was me, David," Kyle said, stepping forward. "I kissed her. It was my mistake." David turned sharply, his eyes full of rage. "Your mistake?" He took a step toward Kyle, his eyes blazing. "Do you even understand what you've done? She's my wife, Kyle." I couldn't watch this. Everything inside me screamed that this was my fault, that I had to stop it. But I was paralyzed. I wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. Everything was happening so fast, and it felt like I was losing control of my life. Kyle tried to explain, but David wasn't listening. He was too angry, too hurt to hear anything that could justify what had happened. I felt tears begin to roll down my cheeks, and I turned away, unable to bear the chaos. "We both made a mistake," I finally said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm not excusing myself. But please, David, we have to try to work through this." But he just shook his head. His face showed not only pain, but also disappointment. Disappointment in me, in our marriage, in our family. He turned and walked to the bedroom, slamming the door behind him. I heard the lock click, and I knew that our world was falling apart. I didn't know how to stop this catastrophe, how to put everything back in place. Kyle stood in the middle of the living room, his head bowed. We were silent, and in that silence, there was something irreversible. What had happened wasn't just a mistake. It was something that had already changed us all forever. After the night's argument, the house felt empty. The silence hanging in the rooms was tense and frightening. In the morning, I found that Kyle had left. A note lay on the kitchen table. The handwriting was sloppy, rushed, but I could make out the words, "I'm sorry for everything, Jessica. This is my fault. I'm leaving so as not to make things worse." Tears welled up in my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. I understood that this was probably the best decision for all of us, but that didn't make it any easier. David was in the bedroom, getting ready for work when I walked in, holding the note in my hand. He looked at me, his eyes cold and indifferent. "Kyle left," I said quietly, handing him the note. He took it, glanced at it, and I saw his face tense for a moment. "He did the right thing," David replied, tossing the note onto the bed. He turned away from me, buttoning his shirt, and added, "But now we need to figure out what's going on with us. I need to know what you're going to choose, Jessica. Do you want to keep our family or follow your feelings for Kyle?" His words were icy, and I felt everything inside me tighten. I knew this was a moment of truth, but the answer wasn't that simple. I loved David, but our life hadn't been the same for a long time. I felt like something was missing, that there was an emptiness in our marriage that I couldn't fill. That was what led me to what happened with Kyle. But I also knew that, despite everything, I didn't want to destroy our family. I couldn't imagine my life without David. "I don't know," I replied, feeling my voice tremble. "I need time to understand how I feel." David was silent. He just nodded, but I could see that his face had become cold, as if he had built a wall around himself. He picked up his briefcase and left the room, leaving me alone. I sat on the edge of the bed, feeling the emptiness inside me becoming unbearable. Hours passed, and I couldn't find peace. Memories of the night's argument kept coming back to me. I saw David's face, full of pain and disappointment, and I knew that our marriage would never be the same. Something between us was broken, and I didn't know if it could be fixed. David tried to maintain an appearance of calm, but I could see that he had grown colder. Our conversations were minimal, and he avoided meeting my gaze. All of this reminded me of how deeply I had betrayed his trust. I knew that words couldn't fix anything now, but I also didn't know what else I could do. Kyle was gone, and the house felt even emptier. I realized that what had happened was wrong, but a shadow of the feelings I had for him still lingered inside me. I felt that I could no longer pretend everything was fine, but I also couldn't make the first move toward David. Everything seemed too complicated, tangled, and beyond my control. After Kyle left, the house felt foreign. I tried to live as if everything was normal. I did my usual chores, cooked meals, kept the house tidy. But inside, there was an emptiness I didn't know how to deal with. I felt that I could no longer pretend everything was fine, but I also didn't know how to change it. David was cold, but he didn't completely distance himself. He didn't make any drastic moves that would lead to a final break. We lived like neighbors, polite, reserved, without much emotion. It hurt me to see him like that, but I knew I couldn't blame him. One evening after dinner, David suggested we talk. We sat in the kitchen where the aroma of our meal still lingered, and the silence was almost deafening. He looked at me, his expression serious but not angry. There was something in his eyes that I hadn't seen in a long time, a desire to fix things. "I don't want it to end like this," he said, breaking the silence. "I want to try to rebuild what we had, but I can't do that if Kyle stays in our lives." His words were harsh but honest. He looked at me expectantly, and I knew this was the moment I had to make a choice. I had to decide what was more important to me, my family or the feelings that had sparked between Kyle and me. "You're asking me to cut all ties with him?" I asked, though the answer was obvious. "Yes," he nodded. "If you really want to save our marriage, Kyle can't be in our lives. At all." Tears welled up in my eyes, and I turned away so he wouldn't see my weakness. I knew he was right. I couldn't keep Kyle around and try to save our marriage at the same time. But the thought of never seeing him again caused me immense pain. I realized that my feelings for Kyle were deeper than I wanted to admit. It wasn't just infatuation, not just desire. It was something more. Something that filled the emptiness I had felt for so long. But I also knew I couldn't destroy everything David and I had built. I loved him. Maybe not the same way as before, but I did love him. "Okay," I finally said, trying to hold back my tears. "I'll stay. I'll do everything I can to keep our family." David nodded, and I saw his expression soften slightly. But there was still a chasm between us, and I didn't know if we would ever be able to bridge it. My decision came with immense pain, and I felt that a part of me remained with Kyle. But I knew it was the only way to keep what was left. David stood up and walked over to me, gently embracing me. His hug was warm but distant. I closed my eyes, trying to feel something more than just gratitude for his willingness to give us a chance. But inside, there was emptiness, and I didn't know how to fill it. Saying goodbye to Kyle was inevitable. We arranged to meet on neutral ground, a small parking lot near a cafe on the outskirts of town. The place was quiet and almost deserted, which made the moment slightly less painful. When I arrived, he was already waiting, leaning against his car. His eyes, when he saw me, held a mix of sadness and determination. I got out of my car and walked closer, trying to keep myself together. Inside, everything was trembling, but I knew this had to happen. We couldn't continue living in this uncertainty. "Thank you for coming," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Of course," he replied softly, his eyes meeting mine, and I felt the weight of the moment. "You wanted to talk?" I nodded, unable to find the words. We stood in silence for a few seconds, and I realized that silence was all that remained between us. What had been said without words was far louder than anything we could have spoken. "Kyle, I just wanted to say thank you," I finally said, "for everything, for the feelings you gave me. You reminded me that I'm still capable of feeling, that I'm alive." His eyes softened slightly and he took a step closer. I could see the pain in his eyes, and it tore me apart. "I only regret that it ended like this," he said, his voice trembling. "I never wanted to hurt you." "I know," I whispered, feeling tears welling up. "I didn't want it to be this way either." He took my hand, and I allowed myself this weakness, to feel his warmth one last time. We stood like that for a few moments, until reality began to catch up with us. I knew this was the end, and that from now on we'd be walking different paths. "I'm moving to another city," he said, still holding my hand. "I need to start over. Maybe it's for the best for both of us." I nodded, understanding that it was the right step. He needed to leave to give both of us a chance to start anew. "Goodbye, Kyle," I said, barely holding back my emotions. He let go of my hand, and I felt something break inside. We looked at each other, and I knew that this goodbye wasn't just to him, but also to the part of me that had lived for these feelings. "Goodbye, Jessica," he replied, his voice quiet, with a hint of reconciliation. As he got into his car and drove away, I was left alone in that empty parking lot. The wind blew cold against my face, and there was a quiet but inevitable understanding in my heart that my life would never be the same. All I could do was accept that fact and forgive myself for all the choices that had led us to this moment. "Forgive me, Jessica," I whispered softly, as if speaking to myself. It was a forgiveness I finally allowed myself to give, and in that moment, I knew it was the only way to move forward. It had been a few weeks since Kyle left. The house was quieter, calmer, but that calmness was deceptive. I felt like my entire life with David was now balancing on a fine, unstable line between trying to restore our former relationship and acknowledging that it would never be the same again. David was trying to bring everything back to how it used to be. He suggested that we spend more time together, and I was grateful for his willingness. We started taking more walks in the evenings, cooking dinners together, watching movies. He talked about taking a vacation somewhere, just the two of us, away from everything that reminded us of the past. But even in those moments, I felt a wall between us. He tried to do everything he could to bring back our former closeness, but I knew that deep down, we had both changed. Our relationship was filled with care, but it had lost the ease it once had. It was a difficult, sometimes forced process, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were playing roles, hoping that over time they would become real. We went to family therapy at David's insistence. I knew he wanted things to get better, and I tried to share his desire. But even in the sessions with the therapist, I felt a sense of detachment. I listened as we both described our feelings, as we tried to explain what had happened, but I couldn't escape the feeling that it was all too superficial. We were talking, but neither of us truly understood the other. It was as if there was an invisible barrier between us that couldn't be overcome. The therapist asked us questions, trying to awaken our emotions, but I felt empty. I knew we needed to move forward, that we needed to try, but there was an emptiness inside me that wouldn't go away, no matter how hard I tried. These were painful sessions that brought more questions than answers. I tried to connect with David. I knew he was also struggling with his feelings, that he wanted to keep our family together. But in the moments when he tried to hug me or say something warm, I felt something tighten inside me. I was no longer the Jessica he knew before. Everything that had happened with Kyle had changed me. And I couldn't go back to the past, no matter how beautiful it seemed. Sometimes, when I was alone, I started to think that my life couldn't stay the way it was. I couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine. I wanted to make a drastic change in my life, but I didn't know how to do it. I felt lost, as if I didn't understand who I was or what I needed. In the evenings, when I looked out the window at the descending night, I thought about how, in this new world without Kyle, I had to find myself again. But I didn't yet know where to start. It felt like I was standing at a crossroads, with many roads ahead, but none of them seemed right. I needed something that could give me the confidence that I could once again feel whole,